And welcome back, everyone, to ColeJakeTV. It is a pleasure to have you with us today. And if you were with us yesterday, we were experiencing Stephen and his arrest, and his subsequent trial occurs today. And if you also were with us yesterday, we taught a little bit about the story principle that Jesus used. He used, by way of story, the use of parables. And as we get into the story of Israel today, that Stephen gives us a historical view on the story of Israel from the time of Abraham. We'll get into that momentarily. We often must think, why does Jesus use this method? Why did Jesus use parables? Really, the long and short of it is that Jesus chose the method of storytelling. He chose the method of parables simply to get people's attention. In a very short period of time, those that were walking by as Jesus was speaking, if you recall, he moved from the synagogue to the Sea of Galilee. Sometimes he would be in a boat speaking to the masses. Sometimes he would be walking along the shores. But oftentimes, the congregation of laymen and laywomen that were going by, the common day folk like you and me and anyone that would normally be experiencing hearing Jesus talk, he would use story, he would use parables to quickly get their attention. So he's in the open air of the day, he's out by the Sea of Galilee, and he's trying to get people's attention very quickly. So when you think about Jesus started using this new method, this new story method, this method we call parables, it is parables that you will also find in the Old Testament. This is not totally original to just what Jesus taught. You hear about parables oftentimes throughout the Old Testament. If you recall, you'll hear one that's one of the most famous parables found in 2 Samuel, and that has to do with David and Bathsheba. So when Jesus decided to use this method of storytelling, he's taking these ideas, rather abstract, and he's creating them into more of a concrete form. He's illustrating them visually to where you can almost taste it. You can almost touch it. You can see it so visually, you don't have to try and imagine it so much. But also, Jesus uses this clever form of story making to not only take these abstract ideas and make them concrete, but he's forcing people, which I find to be one of the deepest parts of why he uses this, to think for themselves. He's forcing them to come to a reality and to discover a truth by thinking for themselves in the use of these stories. He didn't want to think for them. He wanted to guide them, guide their thoughts into thinking for themselves, and in this way, to discover truth for themselves. As we get into Acts chapter 7, we're going to see in the use of story that Stephen uses, an opportunity to share the history and the story of Israel from the time of Abraham. Let's begin. Acts chapter 7. Then the high priest asked Stephen, "Are these accusations true?" It's very likely this high priest was Caiaphas, the same high priest that questioned Jesus. This was Stephen's reply. "Brothers and fathers, listen to me. Our glorious God appeared to our ancestor Abraham in Mesopotamia before he settled in Haran. God told him, 'Leave your native land and your relatives and come into the land that I will show you.' So Abraham left the land of the Chaldeans and lived in Haran until his father died. Then God brought him here to the land where you now live. But God gave him no inheritance here, not even 1 square foot of land. God did promise, however, that eventually the whole land would belong to Abraham and his descendants, even though he had no children yet. God also told him that his descendants would live in a foreign land, where they would be oppressed as slaves for 400 years. But I will punish the nation that enslaves them. I will punish the nation that enslaves them. God said, and in the end, they will come out and worship me here in this place. God also gave Abraham the covenant of circumcision at that time. So Abraham became the father of Isaac. He circumcised him on the 8th day, and the practice was continued when Isaac became the father of Jacob, and Jacob became the father of the 12 patriarchs of the Israelite nation. These patriarchs were jealous of their brother Joseph, and they sold him to be a slave in Egypt. But God was with him and rescued him from all his troubles. And God gave him favor before Pharaoh, king of Egypt. God also gave Joseph unusual wisdom, so that Pharaoh appointed him governor over all of Egypt and put him in charge of the palace. Think about this for a moment. God's faithfulness through and unto Joseph. God was with Joseph. What Stephen is emphasizing here is the spiritual presence of God with Joseph at that time. You know, Joseph did not need to go to the temple to be close to God. I think Stephen is trying to sort of hint at this. There was no temple at Joseph's time, but God was with Joseph. He was with him, even in the midst of his troubles. And I think Stephen's message here is quite plain. He's saying, you have rejected Jesus to this crowd that's essentially put him on trial. And he's also pointing out, not only have you rejected Jesus, who was like Moses, we'll see that in just a moment as he touches on Moses, yet Jesus is greater than Moses, who was like Joseph, but Jesus was greater than Joseph. And he's basically trying to point out to them here in just a moment that your denial of these people in the past is akin to your denial again of the real judge, the real ruler, our Savior who has come into this world, your denial of him. So that's what he's getting at. Verse 11. But a famine came upon Egypt and Canaan. There was great misery, and our ancestors ran out of food. Jacob heard that there was still grain in Egypt. So he sent his sons, our ancestors, to buy some. The second time they went, Joseph revealed his identity to his brothers, and they were introduced to Pharaoh. Then Joseph sent for his father, Jacob, and all his relatives to come to Egypt, 75 persons in all. So Jacob went to Egypt. He died there, as did our ancestors. Their bodies were taken to Shechem and buried in the tomb Abraham had bought for a certain price from Hamor's sons in Shechem. As the time drew near, when God would fulfill his promise to Abraham, the number of our people in Egypt greatly increased. But then a new king came to the throne of Egypt, who knew nothing about Joseph. This king exploited our people and oppressed them, forcing parents to abandon their newborn babies so they would die. Verse 20, at that time Moses was born. A beautiful child in God's eyes, his parents cared for him at home for 3 months. And when they had to abandon him, Pharaoh's daughter adopted him. and raised him as her own son. Moses was taught all the wisdom of the Egyptians, and he was powerful in both speech and action. One day, when Moses was 40 years old, he decided to visit his relatives, the people of Israel. He saw an Egyptian mistreating an Israelite. So Moses came to the man's defense and avenged him. Killing the Egyptian, Moses assumed his fellow Israelites would realize that God had sent him to rescue them, but they didn't. The next day he visited them again and saw 2 men of Israel fighting, and he tried to be a peacemaker. "Men," he said, "you are brothers. Why are you fighting each other?" But the man in the wrong pushed Moses aside. "Who made you a ruler and a judge over us?" he asked. "Are you going to kill me as you killed that Egyptian yesterday?" And when Moses heard that, he fled the country and lived as a foreigner in the land of Midian. There his 2 sons were born. Let's press pause here until tomorrow. And tomorrow we will delve into the finishing piece of Stephen's sermon. And ultimately, we will then come across Saul, who we will meet, who will then take us into the next chapter, where we will begin to see one of the greatest conversions on the road to Damascus one has ever seen. And so as we press pause here for today, I want to thank you each and every day, those that are joining us are new and those that are fresh to the channel. Come back to us each and every weekday and join us. We, word by word, verse by verse, book by book, chapter by chapter, we're going through the Word of God as a community, as believers, as newborns, and as babes. So feel free to come back and join ColeJakeTV. And I am your messenger, GB. We look forward to seeing you each and every weekday here at CJTV. And until then, and until next time, have a blessed day.